Hello, this is Professor Werwath. Even though this talk is titled 24 Crises in 2022, the real purpose of this talk is to help students understand the exponential change that's in front of all of us right now, that's underlying much of what's happening in society, and what is perhaps one of the most difficult things for human beings to adapt to, which, exponential change versus linear change. And we'll talk about those things very soon. So fundamentally, linear change is what the human mind seems to be designed to adapt to. So we understand linear thinking. For example, if we can walk 3 miles per hour after 8 hours, we should be somewhere around 24 miles from our point of origin. That makes sense. How far can an army march in a day? Something on the order of 20, maybe 24 miles, depending on rests and stops and things like that. We tend to think linearly. All right. And that linear thinking permeates the field of economics. It permeates the fields of logistics. It permeates almost every field you can imagine, because exponential thinking is just so rare and it's hard for the brain to wrap itself around it. Right. So to take that same example of walking, if you were to walk starting, hour one at 3 miles per hour, but you doubled your walking speed every hour for 8 hours, right? By the end of those 8 hours, your walking speed would be faster than the speed of sound. Now, I know people are going to say that's not possible. I get it. I'm just trying to have you understand the power of nonlinear or exponential thinking, okay? And what it means to be at that, at that level of complexity and that level of rapidity and change, right? So if you think about that 8-hour span of, doubling your speed every hour, if you're going, in excess of 800 miles an hour after 8 hours, you're only doing 400 miles an hour the hour before. Okay. So in that last hour, you're literally adding an extra 400 miles per hour to your speed. Okay. So that is the realm that we're dealing with here, right? As exponential change grows, right, you're going to be experiencing dramatic changes in the environment around you, right? Human beings can embrace linear thinking, very difficult for them to embrace exponential thinking. Every S curve, every adoption curve you've ever seen, whether it's the Rogers curve or these S curves, right? They all have a linear and they all have an exponential segment to them, okay? So, most companies get caught when we transition from linear to exponential. That transition, that inflection point is very difficult to manage. How do you manage logistics? How do you manage supply chain? How do you manage production capacity? How do you manage staffing? How do you manage your budgets, right? When you're going from linear to exponential, it's very, very difficult, right? Only one company, as an example, made the transition between horse-drawn carriages, right, and automobile manufacturing. In other words, only one company was able to traverse both, in essence, be a horse-drawn carriage manufacturer and then make it into automobile manufacturing. That company was Chevrolet. There were literally hundreds of companies that failed, that could not make that transition, all right? And that one company, Chevrolet, is now part of the General Motors empire. It has survived well beyond 100 years now. But the transition from horse and buggy, horse-drawn carriage, right, to automobile in this country was 13 years. And you'll see what that looks like here, right? On the left, you see a picture of New York City, and you see horse-drawn carriages, almost exclusively horse-drawn carriages, 1900. That same street, 13 years later, was almost exclusively, and it is at least apparently exclusively, automobiles, okay, as we know them, or as we knew them back then, as we more or less know them today, right? So in 13 years, that transition was clearly nonlinear, right? It was exponential. We had automobiles prior to 1900 for dozens of years. That wasn't the issue. The issue was mass adoption. The issue was that exponential portion of the curve, right? Meaning this inflection point that you see on the left, that point where it says you are here, right? Everything to the right of that is exponential. And from a human perception, it'll feel like chaos. it'll feel like radical change, and it'll feel like something that's very difficult to adapt to, right? And it may lead to certain types of collapse in certain industries, certain businesses, certain economies, right? Even certain currencies, right? As I am basically audio tape or videotaping this now, right? We are hearing about Russia's ruble collapsing because of the sanctions coming from the Ukraine war. So you can see how, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, this wasn't an issue for the ruble. Today it is, right? In the Russian stock market and, everything else that goes with that Russian economy. So things can change very, very quickly. You enter this segment of chaos from, ironically, prior to that stage, a segment of disappointment, right? So here I am as an electric car fan, aficionado, right? Owner, and soon to be owner of a Tesla, which is hopefully going to be delivered soon. There's this segment of disappointment prior to that inflection. It's just like, that change is coming. Where is it, right? How come I don't see more EVs on the road? How come none of my family owns an EV except for me? How come very few of my neighbors own an EV, right? So you get this segment of disappointment, and then suddenly that exponential curve kicks in, and then you enter from disappointment into chaos, okay? And that's what we're managing here today. The right-hand curve basically talks about the classic S curve and how accentuated that S curve becomes when you have interactive innovations. By that, I believe they're talking about like social media, any innovation that requires or includes significant interaction of the users, right? So that would be messaging, cell phones, anything where you've got, Facebook, human-to-human interactions. You can see how fast Facebook didn't take 13 years to get to that level of saturation. Facebook probably got to that same level of saturation into the marketplace in about half that time. So 13 years was actually a long period of time for the radical adoption of a new technology compared to what we see with these interactive innovations. So let's talk about the 24 crises, right? And I think these are linked, because what's happening is the world is adapting to significant change in multiple dimensions, right? These dimensions are woven into these crises. So COVID-19, right? We're all adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic and its variants. There's several variants that have already come out, and there's rumors to be more. But right now, at least February 2022, we're at a stage where people are starting to relax the limitations and restrictions that otherwise have been keeping the economy and others from enjoying full liberties, right? So COVID-19's epidemic was one of 24 crises we're juggling right now in my mind, right? The second one is energy, shortage of energy causing skyrocketing prices. This has become accentuated during the Ukraine war, but I think it's also been basically brewing in different parts of the world. We see prices well above $3 a gallon, and now today over $4 a gallon in much of the United States, rumored to go as high as $6 or $7 a gallon. We're seeing oil trading at near $100 a barrel, rumored to go maybe to 120 or above. So the Ukraine war is itself one of the crises, the Putin expansionism, and whether it stops at Ukraine or goes beyond is anyone's guess. Prior to anything Putin was doing, we had collapses of economies, whole economies, right? In Turkey, Venezuela, Syria, and Lebanon. And I'm sure there's many more. These are the ones that I'm kind of tracking myself and watching carefully. It's not always publicized. It's not always put out there, but you're seeing, economic stress in all of these countries right now to the point of virtual economic collapse, right? A demographic cliff. What do I mean by that? This shift towards an older population, a shortage of younger people. Why is that important? Young people fuel economies. Young people fuel economic growth, GDP growth, jobs, and the ability to deliver goods and services around the world. Younger people do that, right? Somewhere between ages of, let's say, 20 to 40. Those are the people that fuel the economy. And if you have a shortage of them, like we see in Japan, like we see in China, like we see in Europe, like we see to some extent already in the US, right? You're going to see economic slowdown because of it, and a shift towards The older demographics means that you're going to be having a healthcare services oriented economy like they have in Japan right now. Climate crisis, I mean, that you could argue is 24 crises in and of itself, right? You're seeing, global warming, but you're also seeing, a lot of secondary and tertiary effects that come from that, feedback loops, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So the CO2 in the atmosphere, we all know the story, right? But the climate crisis is causing all sorts of weather-related crises, some of which I'll be laying out on this list, right? Droughts and fires, right? Devastating communities, certainly in the US, but it's not just limited to the US. We're seeing this to some extent around the world. Fresh water, and this is somewhat independent even of the climate crisis. This is just the depletion of the aquifers that we've been pumping dry for the last 50, 60 years. This is certainly true in the US. The Ogallala Aquifer is a fraction of what it used to be, and it's supplying water to a good chunk of the heartland that is supplying food to the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So this is a potential domino effect that if we don't manage carefully, if we don't find ways to replenish those aquifers, we're going to be in serious trouble, right? We already, to some extent, are. We're seeing farms shut down because of freshwater shortages, certain types of crops. Alfalfa is very water intensive, and certain types of nuts and trees, et cetera, that frankly, we can't afford to grow anymore. And the farmers have abandoned them and chopped them down in terms of switching to a different crop or shutting down their farms altogether. Refugee crises, right? And this comes from some of these other crises, for example, the Ukraine war, the energy, the collapse of economies, and also climate. So you could argue this is a secondary effect, but these refugees need someplace to go and need some way to sustain themselves and to become viable members of the community. World debt has never been higher. We see it on sovereign debt. We see this in both public and private debt. Student debt's never been higher. Consumer debt's never been higher. Mortgage debt's never been higher. And some say that it's unsustainable, that it really can't be sustained at this level. The sovereign debt alone, we're talking well over $100 trillion around the world. Global inflation, right? Some say hyperinflation, which leads to and is basically linked with currency crises. Global supply chain disruptions, some of which came from COVID-19, others came from other issues that are geopolitical in nature. Chip shortages, you could argue that's a subset of the global supply chain, but I think part of that is the disruption inside the auto industry of using more chips, not understanding the demand curves and not being able to supply an adequate amount in support of that shift. The crisis of democracy, right? We're seeing democracy in trouble in the US and elsewhere. Motivations towards limiting the number of people voting and the types of people voting and the locations of the vote, trying to jerry-rig or gerrymander the voting process so that basically the incumbents can stay in power. The crisis of journalism, right? As we know it, or as we knew it, I should say, print journalism, obviously, but even electronic journalism being replaced with blogs and with, YouTube channels and things of that nature, such that professional journalists that are independent and objective and trained and professional are basically vaporizing. They're very hard to find and very hard to trust. There's a crisis of trust that I probably should have included on this list, but I think that part is intermingled with this crisis of journalism. Journalists were people we trusted. With their departure goes the trust level across the world about politics, about facts, about crises. The crisis of misinformation, right? So that is kind of part of the trust issue, but there's also a very concerted effort to manipulate. This is a crisis of manipulation, right? Manipulating the media that's been erected and basically built up over the years, social media in particular, which is easy to manipulate because we've removed any barriers to entry. I mean, anyone with a cell phone can set up a YouTube channel, and that literally opens up, billions of YouTube channels around the world. Earth changes, right? Which causes major societal issues, the thawing of the permafrost, the hurricane levels, the flash floods, the droughts, the fires, all of these things these earth changes are impacting a lot of these other issues. For example, refugees, the crisis of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So supply chains included. Earth changes are real and they're accelerating. Mass extinction, Earth's sixth mass extinction is already underway, right? Insects and bird populations are already diminished. Some people would say, well, good riddance, these bugs are bothering me. Well, insects are a definite part of the ecosystem, a critical part. And if they don't play their part, and therefore they can't play the part that includes pollination, right? So the bee population collapse is a significant part of our own food chain. So we're talking 20-30% of our food gets pollinated by these insect pollinators, and we're not addressing the collapse of that part of the ecosystem. The poisoning of the environment, whether it's plastics, forever chemicals, heavy metals, algal blooms, et cetera, et cetera. There's all sorts of diminishing quality of our water supply, and our food supply gets impacted directly because of that. And that also is in part linked to disrupted cycles, whether it's the water cycle, nitrogen cycle, carbon cycles. These are all being impacted by our excessive use of fertilizers, our excessive use of water, and water being pumped from these aquifers that are causing all sorts of other issues. And of course, the carbon cycle with climate change. So beyond that, right, healthcare systems, right, and this was accentuated by COVID-19, but we're seeing in many cases hospitals, nursing homes, delivery systems stressed to the point of near collapse, or in some cases they've already shut down. They just can't handle the demand, and they also have diminished supply. The Great Resignation, right? Almost every industry is experiencing this, but it's very hard to hire people. It's very hard to replace the people that have left. And of course, automation and robotics is not really at a stage yet that they can easily step in. So certain industries are having significant shortfalls in labor. And with that comes the inability to deliver and fulfill their commitments, right? General social upheaval, right, towards authoritarianism, which links back to the crisis in democracy. The Arab Spring is now, in my mind, becoming something of a global spring. I've got some images here I want to share with you. I want you to kind of guess what countries these are, because they're not the countries you would think, right? So, you look at this and you think to yourself, well, this is a country in disarray. This is a country with significant issues. People are packing the streets. Probably the last country you would think this is Canada, but that's exactly what this is, right? Meanwhile, very friendly and peaceful, loving countries such as New Zealand, same thing, right? Sweden, same thing. And of course, we all know about US and Washington. Who would have thought this would be an image of Washington, DC, whether it's January 6, 2021, or any other day of any other year? How could this be the capital of the leading country in the free world, which is, of course, the United States? So if this is our best example of democracy, you got to wonder what's going on. Old rules are changing. They're quickly changing, right? Success is about adaptation to the future, right? Organizations are, whether we like it or not, temporary endeavors. We tend to think of them as lifelong. General Electric's been here for so long. Amazon's been here for 20 plus years, but they are increasingly becoming temporary, right? And so too are the employee tenures. So on the left, you see the average company lifespan in the S&P index, a rolling 7-year average, and you can see a very clear trend downward. So the average company is getting a lifespan that's shorter and shorter, right? Meanwhile, if you look at employee tenures, and that's what this right-hand chart is, and I apologize for its busyness, but it basically breaks it down by age group. And you can see in general, you're seeing employee tenures at individual companies dropping dramatically. It was not atypical back in the 80s to have people with 15 years tenure in a company. Now it's barely 9 or 10. So in general, that curve is heading downward. And of course, when you break it down by age, the older folks tend to be with the higher tenures, and the younger folks down here with the shorter tenures. So bottom line, we're seeing tremendous change. We're seeing that reaction to change, volatility. We're seeing loss of loyalty on both sides between the company and the employee, the demand for more adaptation and flexibility in the work environment in response to some of these various stresses. And all I can say is that this is possibly the new normal. I don't see things necessarily changing in the near future. So I think it's incumbent upon us as we design our systems and organizations to just simply embrace these facts, realize them, and to move forward. So with that, I will end the recording and let you guys discuss it from here. Thank you very much.